Welcome to week 2 of our class, Covenant and God's Purpose for the World. I'll remind you, the resource we're using for this class is this little book. It's part of the Short Studies in Biblical Theology series called Covenant and God's Purpose for the World by Dr. Thomas Schreiner. You certainly don't have to read this book in order to take this class. We're going to cover the main structure of this book and look at the main content, but if you want to get more of a flavor, if you want to read this, this would be a great resource for you to purchase. It is, I think it's only about 130 pages. It's under 130 pages. It's a quick read. It's a really easy read. Dr. Schreiner is not only a preeminent New Testament scholar, but he's a wonderful writer and writes in a way in which lay people who aren't necessarily trained in academic theology, can read and understand. He writes at a really accessible level. So I would encourage you, maybe if you've not even read a lot of theological works and maybe you're worried there's going to be words and terminology, things I don't know, I would encourage you, that's not true. With Dr. Schreiner. That's not true with this book, Covenant and God's Purpose for the World. It's an incredibly accessible book, and so I would encourage you to read this. You can find this, I think it's $12 or $13 on Amazon. You can get it in most places. An incredible, helpful resource. So, just sort of a recap, remember we're talking about covenant in the Bible and tracing the theme of covenant throughout the Scriptures. And we began last week with the covenant of creation, with God's covenant with Adam and Eve, that he makes creation, that they break there in the garden, and then the promise that comes after that, the promise to redeem man by the seed of the woman. So today, we're going to pick up and cover the covenant with Noah. As we talk about this second main covenant, the covenant with Noah that we've said earlier, is in some ways a reestablishment, a renewal of the covenant of creation, the covenant that God makes with Adam and Eve. In order to talk about this covenant with Noah, we're going to begin by talking about the background. How do we get there? If you want to turn in your Bible, Genesis chapter 8, beginning in verse 20, I'm going to read a larger section down through verse 17 of chapter 9. This is the covenant with Noah. We're going to read this, and then we'll talk about how we get here. Well, actually, scratch that. Let's talk about how we get here first, and then we'll read the covenant. So we see Genesis 3, Adam and Eve sin, the curse comes upon them. 4, Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel. 5, you have this so-and-so begets so-and-so, and then he died. This guy's not the seed, this one's not the one, this one's not the one, death is in the world. What we see in the narrative of Genesis is that by the time you get to Genesis chapter 6, humankind has gotten worse and worse and worse. And we have there at the beginning of chapter 6, it says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his day shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animal and creeping things and birds of the heaven, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, you say, well, that's a weird story. Maybe you've never read that before. And you say, well, what is he talking about here? The sons of God. They take for their wives. They bear children with the daughters of man, and they mighty men of renown. Listen, I'm not even going to go into that right now. There are several plausible explanations. Okay, what is Moses talking about there? What exactly is happening with beginning of Genesis 6? Here's the point. Here's why I'm not going to go into this. No matter how you take that, right? And there are 3 or 4 orthodox explanations for what's going on in Genesis 6. No matter how you take that, the point is this. Everything is messed up, right? Whatever's happening in Genesis 6, whatever it is messed up. It's not supposed to be like that. It is sinful, it is wrong, it is wicked, so that it leads to this point that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That God says it is really bad, so bad on the earth. Sin is so wicked on the earth that God is going to blot out man from whom he's created, that he's going to start over. He's going to blot out every living thing except for Noah. Noah finds favor. We're told that Noah is righteous, blameless before the Lord. Now, in the New Testament, Hebrews 11 tells us the reason that Noah is righteous, the reason he walked with God was because he had faith, that he's counted righteous because of his faith, that his personal holiness, his personal righteousness was a reflection then of his faith in God, that Noah trusted God, Noah walked in faith with God, and therefore he was righteous. He was in that way blameless. So Noah is spared. Noah and his family, God tells him to build an ark. The song, build an arky, right? Build it out of gopher barky. That's neither here nor there, but you know the story, right? Noah builds an arky, and he puts all the animals in there 2 by 2. They all come. He fills the ark up. Noah and his family go. The rains come. The rains came down. The floods came up, and the whole earth is flooded. Everybody but Noah and the ark die in the flood. Now, this is one of those a sticking point for me. I learned this story on a felt board as a kid, right? You got little Noah, and you got the giraffe sticking out of the ark, and you just got this boat, and you learn this as a happy story, and it is a happy story for Noah. Works out well for Noah and the animals on the ark. We got to remember, this is God wiping out the entire creation. God flooding the entire earth so that everyone dies. Everyone comes under judgment except for Noah and his family and those that are on the ark, those that are saved through judgment by the ark. This is the judgment of God on creation. This is how bad things are. And so Noah's on the ark. He is spared from the judgment of God by the ark. He's on the ark. Ultimately, the flood subsides. God brings him up out of the ark and then reestablishes this covenant with them. In 8 verse 20, it says, Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from every man. For his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, and increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many as came out of the ark, as it is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established, not cut, I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So there's just the raw text of the covenant, and we've talked about the background. How did we get here to this God making this covenant with Noah? And then let's talk about a really important feature of this new covenant, and that is that we see here Noah as a new Adam. Noah not as a perfect Adam, that would be Christ. That's not going to happen until we get to the new covenant. But what we see here is Moses writing and showing us that Noah is a new Adam, that there are parallels here between creation and this recreation after the flood. God created, God destroyed the earth, and now God is, in a sense, recreating afterwards, after the flood, with Noah as the new Adam. He's, in some sense, starting over with Noah. So there are lots of parallels between what God does in creation with Adam and Eve, and then what God is doing post-creation, post-flood, with Noah there. So let's talk about these again. I'm going to just giving you sort of the big title slide. You're going to find more notes in the PDF. So if you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching on the app, you can look. I think it's right about, I can't see it from here, but I think it's right down there. You're going to click that link, right? No, not that one. Yep, that one. You're going to click that link right there, and you're going to find a PDF. And that PDF is going to give you some more detailed notes than what you're going to see here. It's going to give you also a place to take notes if you want to write more there to take notes. So let's talk about Noah as the new Adam. What are the parallels between creation and this new creation of sorts that comes after the flood? Number one, the original creation takes place when the earth was formless and void and full of water and chaos. And what happens? When does this new creation take place? After the earth has been filled with water, right? It's covered with water. The first creation takes place when the earth is covered with water. The second creation takes place when the earth is covered with water. The waters recede and God recreates the earth. Number two is the flourishing of animals, right? The birds, creeping things, animals, right? That they're called to be fruitful, to multiply in Genesis 1. And the same thing is true after the flood in 8, 17, and 19, that they're going to be fruitful and multiply, that they're going to, in the same way that they did at creation, they're going to flourish. Number three is this idea of the seasons, right? So in Genesis 1, 14 through 18, God institutes the seasons. Night and day, hot and cold, seed time and harvest, the day and night, summer, winter, the seasons. And then what do we get in this new covenant, this new recreation? While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. That God in some ways reinstitutes, turns back on the seasons, right? The whole world has been flooded. The whole world has been destroyed, and God reinstitutes. God restarts the seasons. He brings back these regular patterns, the regular pattern of the seasons, hot and cold, day and night, summer and winter, resume. And number four is the call for man to be fruitful and multiply. Right? We see this in the creation account. We see this when God makes Adam and Eve. And then we see it again in verse 1 of chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It is the exact same thing that God tells Adam and Eve. It is a recapitulation, a renewal of this call to be fruitful and multiply that we see at creation and we see in this recreation. Number six, not only are they called to be fruitful and multiply, but they're called to exercise dominion. We talked about this at length in week 1, that Adam and Eve were called to exercise dominion, called to exercise rule as vice-regents, as sons and daughters made in the image of God, ruling as priest-kings on the earth. They're to exercise rule, exercise dominion over the whole earth. We saw that in Genesis 1 at the creation of all things, and we see that now again in Genesis 9, right? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That they have this desire then, in verse 2, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands I have delivered them. Right? Be fruitful and multiply, increase on the earth greatly, and multiply in it. That God reestablishes the dominion of man. That God calls Noah to a very similar thing to what he calls Adam and Eve, and that is to exercise dominion as those who are vice-regents, as those who are made in the image of God, bearing sonship, operating as priest-kings, mediating the blessings of God to the creation of God. So number 6, food. God in Genesis 1 in creation provides food for Adam and Eve, provides food for man. In chapter 9, verse 3, God again provides food. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. He gives them plants. What's different here in creation is that God gives them now animals to eat, not just plants, but God gives them every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. God gives them food to eat, that they can eat meat, praise God, that God did that for us. And then ultimately could give us bacon, which is like the height of all things. This is preparing for what's going to come in the New Testament when God tells us we can eat bacon, but God gives them not just food, but God gives them meat, which is in some ways an escalation from what he does in creation, but again, it is a parallel between creation and this new creation that's happening here. Number 7, the image of God that we saw in Genesis 1, that man is made in the image of God, and the likeness of God is reinstituted, right? It is recapitulated, it is renewed here in chapter 9. If you look at 9:26, he said also, blessed be the Lord of God, the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan serve that's not the text. That's not the one I'm trying to read. That's not the text I'm trying to get. 9:6. Sorry. I read 9:26. Sorry, not 9:26. 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. There we go. Genesis 1, man is made in the image of God, the likeness of God. He bears the image of God. And then God now talks about this man, though it's marred, this image of God is still in man. Therefore, when his blood is shed, that death is the consequence for that. And he grounds that consequence in the fact that God is made in the image of God, that to take the life of a man is no small matter. The animals that do it should be put to death. That men who do it should be put to death because God is made in his image. We saw that at creation. We see that again here at this new creation. And then number 8 is the renewal. It says, this is the sign of the covenant. This is 9:17. This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Right? This is not a cutting of a covenant. This is established, which is in some sense a renewal, a recapitulation. Between the creation covenant, God is sort of renewing it, resuming it. So, one, I want you to see there is a significant parallel between the creation account and this new creation. And it's not that they're exactly the same. There is what we would call continuity, right? There are connections, things that are the same in both. But there is discontinuity, right? That means that there are things that aren't the same. The meat example is one example. God gives them meat to eat, not just plant. But there are other ways in which we see discontinuity, in which there is an escalation. Things have changed some. So let's talk about the nature of the covenant with Noah. All right, so we've talked about the background. We've talked about Noah as the new Adam, this sort of recreation as opposed to creation. Let's talk about the nature of the covenant. Number 1, the fundamental nature of the covenant is this. It is a promise to preserve the human race, which was signaled by God's protecting Noah and his family. God has judged the world, but he has not wiped out the human race. And he's done so by preserving Noah and his family through the storm, through the flood, by the means of an ark to keep Noah alive. And so post-flood, God makes a promise to never again fully destroy the human race. Now, I think that the idea here is not just that he would not destroy them with a flood, but that God will not ultimately destroy the earth. That this is God keeping his promise. The sign of his promise, the fundamental nature here is that God's going to preserve the human race until the end of all things, until he brings redemption. The sign then is a bow. He puts a bow in the sky. So when the clouds come, the bow comes. What is the bow? It is war imagery, right? It is a war image. And God is putting that in the sky to say he's hung it up. Right? He has put aside his bow. He is no longer going to be at war with the human race in this way. He is not just going to not wipe them out by flood, but he's not going to wipe out the human race. He's not going to fully judge the world like he did in the flood until the end of all things. That's not going to happen. Again, that it is in this way a universal promise to not just Noah, but to all of flesh. You see that in 9:15, that God will not destroy the earth again until the end, until the final judgment. That God is in this way saying that he will keep the Genesis 3:15 promise. This is in a sense a common grace that the world may have natural disasters, floods, and tornadoes and hurricanes, things like that. The world will have even occasionally. You've probably heard of pandemics or things like that. That things will happen to the world, but that God will not ever again fully wipe out the human race. That God will not ultimately get rid of the world. That the regular pieces of the world, the night, day, harvest, seed time, cold, heat, summer, winter, the seasons, all the regular functions of the world will continue until God keeps his Genesis 3:15 promise, until the end of all things, until the judgment comes. So the fundamental nature is God is going to preserve mankind. He's going to preserve the world until the judgment. The sign of that is this rainbow that God hangs in the sign and in the sky for all men to see, because it's a universal promise, not just to Noah, that he's not going to destroy Noah, but he's not going to destroy mankind. It is, in this way, an unconditional covenant. So we talked about the often covenants come with conditions. This is an unconditional covenant. God makes this covenant. Noah doesn't do anything. There's nothing here for Noah to do. God is making this covenant, saying he's not going to do this. But that doesn't mean that this covenant doesn't come with stipulations. It doesn't come with things for people to do. One of the interesting pieces here is we begin to see God instituting some human responsibility, some human governance for restraining evil. If you notice even what we read, whoever sheds, this is 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. That God institutes ultimately the penalty of death for those who shed man's blood. And how does the death penalty, how is that judgment going to be carried out? Not by God. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. that God is instituting some human governance, some human restraint of evil. That God is that part of how evil is going to be restrained, part of how the judgment of God will be meted out on this earth, is at times through human agency, through human institutions. That by man shall his blood be shed. This is sort of the precursor, the seeds of human governance, human government. And what is government? It is Romans 13. It is God ordained men to wield the sword to reward the good and to punish the wicked, right? That there are times in which the judgment of God, the justice of God, as best we can, is carried out by men. So we begin to see the seeds of that. So the nature of this is that God is going to preserve the world until the judgment, until he keeps his promise. And so coming out of this, then, we have a sense of a new beginning, right? Adam and Eve were in the garden, everything is perfect, they fail, it goes bad, and it goes bad really quick, and it goes deeply, deeply bad. The desires of men's heart are wicked continually. Everything is bad, so much so that God has to destroy the whole earth. But now, you got Noah. Noah's righteous. Noah walks with faith. Noah has faith. Noah's been saved. Noah's been given this new covenant by God, this sign in the sky. God's never going to do that again. This new beginning, everything is good. We are on the path to the seed of the woman crushing the seed of the serpent. It's going to happen anytime now. Things are getting better, right? Wrong. Right? Almost immediately, things go bad. Right? The covenant of God comes in the first half of chapter 9, and almost immediately after that, it says in verse 20, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard, and he planted a garden, and he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan. Servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in his tents, in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years. And do you know what comes next? You should not be surprised by this. What does it say? And he died. As great as Noah was, he was not the seed of the woman. That comes out of the flood. God gives a covenant with him, gives him a sign, hangs it in the sky, and almost immediately in the biblical narrative, we see Noah what? We see Noah drunk, making a vineyard, being drunk. His sons are having to cover him up. You know, I want you to see this new beginning goes bad, and it goes bad in a similar way. Where's Noah? Noah's in a garden, and what's he do? He sins. Adam's in a garden, and what's he do? He sins. And his son Ham sees him. Ham, in that way, sees his nakedness, and Noah's dishonored by that. Shem and Japheth walk in backwards and cover him up so that they won't see him. Here, Noah curses Ham. Ham's descendants become Canaanites, right? They become those who ultimately are the enemies of God throughout all of the Old Testament. And you're seeing here, even in the cursing of Ham and the blessing of Japheth and Shem, is this separation of the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent, or rather, the Canaan's the seed of the serpent. Ham, Canaan, seed of the serpent. Japheth and Shem are the seed of the woman. You see this separation that's going to continue throughout the Old Testament, right? This, again, we talked about last week, this thread that runs of the bumping between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Right? So we see this things go bad almost immediately with Noah, and then we get in chapter 10, Noah's descendants, and then you think, well, it can't get worse than that. What do you get? You get in chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. The people of God thinking that they are going to do the exact opposite. What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to be fruitful and multiply and do what? Fill the earth and subdue it. Spread out so that they will be mediators of the blessings of God to the whole planet. And what do? They gather in one place and they build a temple. They build this tower, and they think that they can build the tower so tall that they would enhance their own glory, which is the exact opposite. They're gathered in one place, going upward, that they might enhance their own glory. When God says they're to scatter, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth for his glory, so that they'll be mediators of his blessing, and they do the exact opposite, and God has to come down. There's an irony there. It says, and God, they think they have this big tower, and God comes down. He has to sort of come down to see it because God can't see it in heaven. There's the irony there. And then God confuses their languages, and God does to them what they should have done. God scatters them. God confuses their language, gives them different languages, gives them different cultures, and then scatters them over all the face of the earth, which then leads to many of the different cultures that we experience today that ultimately come from the Tower of Babel, which will be reversed at Pentecost and ultimately at the end of all things. So the story is not a happy one here, right? So we have creation, this covenant of creation, then that fails, and you have the covenant with Noah, and that's going well, but then almost immediately, right, they enter into unrighteousness. But this covenant is primarily about God's promise, God's commitment to not wipe out the human race until the ultimate judgment comes, until he brings redemption through the seed of the woman. But all of this is setting up for us the next covenant that's going to come, the covenant with Abraham, in which God now is going to enter into a covenant, not with just universal mankind, but he's going to call out a particular people to be his people, as we see the story of redemptive history move on the storyline, moving us ultimately to the new heaven, new earth, moving ultimately to Christ, to the seed of the woman who's going to defeat the seed of the serpent. So thank you for joining me for week 2. I would encourage you to go read the Genesis flood account, to read the account of the covenant with Noah, and let's praise God that we just lived through a pandemic that was not nearly as bad as it could have been, and part of this is God's promise. God's not going to wipe us out. I at no point feared during the pandemic that the whole world was going to be wiped out, because I believe the promise of God that he is going to preserve us until the end of all things, until the judgment of all things, until we are all, ultimately, all things are summed up in Jesus. And if the pandemic is God's way of judging the earth, we're all fine if we're in Christ, right? We have hope because that seed, the woman, has crushed the head of the serpent. Thank you for joining me for week 2. We'll be back for week 3 as we look at the covenant with Abraham. Thank you so much.